Right. Good afternoon. Welcome to our last panel of the day. In the last few years, including today, we have heard many phrases that start with D: decoupling, de-risking, and deglobalization. At the same time, we are also seeing the emergence of a couple of mega trade blocks around the world, especially in the Asia Pacific region. So our last panel will tell us all about all the words that start with D, as well as these mega trade blocks. And I'm especially excited with the lineup of the most distinguished experts in the field. I really cannot think of a better panel on the issues we're going to discuss. So in our panel, we are very happy to have Michele Ruta from IIEP. Michele has done, if you have ever worked with deep trade agreement database or come across the term DTA, deep trade agreements, that's probably due to Michele's work. I use that on a regular basis. We are also very happy to have Jeff Schott from Peterson. And I highly recommend his books if you want to learn about NAFTA or WTO or TPP or anything related to multilateral regional trade liberalization. I recommend Jeff's books. And Mike, also Professor Mike Plummer from, where's Mike? From Johns Hopkins side, Europe. Mike has been in many institutions, OECD, Brandeis actually also, and he has done a lot of work on trade agreements, in particular the TPP now it's RCEP and CPTPP analysis, and I use that in my teaching and presentation all the time. And last but not least, we are very proud to have Professor Judy Dean join us as our discussant. Judy is professor of international economics from Brandeis and also a visiting scholar at IIEP. Judy's work examines the relationship between trade and environment, and she's also expert on India trade and India economy. And previously, she was in DC, working ITC, International Trade Commission, and SIDES before that. So welcome, and thank you for coming to our panelists. Our first presentation will be by
So thank you so much. Thanks for having me here. I guess this is making me think that I moved from deep integration to disintegration. So that I guess that's not just me. So this is, I'm supposed to do two things, give a little bit of an overview of certain trends, but I also wanted to present some work that I've been doing with Caroline Freund, Aditya Mathu, and Alan Mulaptic. Okay, the first slide, actually at this point is not needed because it's just what Maggie just said. So we see a lot of discussions around on deglobalization, nearshoring, reshoring, friendshoring, etc. And the figure is just the Google searches that have increased over time on this. Now, there is a sort of paradox, no? Back in the 80s, Bob Solow used to say, you see the computer revolution everywhere, but in the productivity statistics. And there is a little bit of that. You know? You seem to see deglobalization everywhere, except in the aggregate trade data. And aggregate is a very important word here to keep in mind. And the reason is that, you know, if the obvious measure that we use is trade as a share of GDP. We all know that there's been globalization, as the economists have called it, but we didn't go back. It's just as flattened, no? But it still remains very high, and the world is very integrated. So the aggregate data don't show deglobalization. Now, our point in this paper is to say that actually we need to look closer to understand what's really happening. And so what we do here is we start from something that is very well known to everyone, which is the fact that the Trump administration imposed tariffs on 60% of imports from China in 2018-19. These tariffs obviously have not been removed by the Biden administration, so they remain there. And this was a pretty monumental shift relative to the previous decades of US trade policy. And all we do here is that look at import data, granular import data for the US at the HS6 10-digit level. So this is really at the product level. And we want to see if something has really changed. What are we interested in seeing is whether we see decoupling with China. That's one thing. We want to see if there is evidence of reshoring or nearshoring or diversification. And then we want to see what's really happening with these supply chains. That's the goal. Now, I'll skip the related literature, but obviously there's been quite a bit of debate on the impact of the Trump tariffs, and these are just some of the main papers. So let me just go through some of the stylized facts that we uncover in this research. Obviously, the paper has all the econometrics on top of that, but I think just the stylized facts are quite telling. And one point is that we did this paper a few months ago, so we used data up to the end of 2022. Obviously, now we have also data for 2023. So we start looking at that. Most of what I'm telling you is not really affected by one additional year of data. So point one is that actually we do see some decoupling. And the timing of decoupling is not random. We see that right where the red line is in 2018-19, that's when the share of China's share of US imports started declining. Overall was 22% at the beginning of the period, so right before the period, I should say, in 2017. In 2022, went down to 16%, so there is a typo there, it's not 5-6 percentage points. 2023 went even farther down, 8 percentage points. So there was something that changed. Obviously, you can say there are many reasons why a trade share and import share can go down. It does not need to be the tariffs. But actually, when you look at it, it really does look like the tariffs have a lot to do with that. Because here, all we did was just to separate the goods where the tariffs were imposed from all the other goods. So on the left, you see the non-tariff products. China does not look very different from the rest of the world. And then we look at the products where the tariffs were imposed. That's where the contraction happened. And actually, we see that there was an increase in the share from the rest of the world. So the tariffs really seem to have something to do with the change in the import share of China. Now, interesting, I was saying that, if you look at the others, it seems that they were compensating China. And one interesting fact is, if we look at the overall Asia's share of US imports, it's been fairly constant over time. It's roughly 45%. So it didn't change after the tariffs. What seems to be happening, and that's what you see in the blue is just what we had before the China share, that started going down and was picked up by some other exporters. And that's something to keep in mind. So if we want to look deeper, what are the other exporters? Well, are countries like Vietnam, Taiwan, some of the neighbors, Canada, Mexico, India, South Korea. Those in 2022 were the ones that grew the most in the US market. And if we look at 2023, it's essentially the same story. So just to pause 1 second. So what this is telling us, first is that the tariffs did have some effects. They seem to be one of the reasons why the China shares in US imports declined. But interestingly, this does not lead to reshoring, because if we had reshoring, meaning the good, instead of being produced in China, is produced in the US, we should see a decline in imports. We don't see a decline in imports. We see that other countries made up what the lost market share of China, mostly in Asia, but not only in Asia. Now, one of the reasons why these policies were put in place was that there seemed to be a need for diversification. So the argument was the US may be too reliant on China. This is risky for some reasons, and therefore we need to diversify to be more resilient vis-a-vis shocks of any type. Now, the interesting thing is that not only we don't see evidence of reshoring, we really don't see evidence of diversification either. So this is the Hirschman index, which is just a standard measure of diversification. And what you should take home from that figure over there is simply that nothing has changed between 2017 and 2022. They are very, very close. So it doesn't seem that after the tariffs, these products became more diversified. It's essentially stayed the same. So what seems to be happening, and which I think is interesting, is something that we are trying to study more in a follow-up work, is that it seems that there is a little bit of China plus one in some sense. So we don't have more diversification. Diversification means I used to import from one source. I think that's risky for whatever reason. Now I want to import from 10 different countries. And we don't see that. What we do see a little bit is China plus one, meaning where China got out, so the US import share of China was reduced, basically China was replaced mostly by one other exporter. It could be in Vietnam, it could be in Mexico, but it was essentially, in most cases, was really one. So you still have, basically, you still depend on one. So you're not really improving diversification, it's just it's not China. And in any case, China remains, at least up to now, in the top 3 supplier for most products. Now, the last point that we wanted to make in this paper is that one needs to make an important distinction between direct dependence and indirect dependence. So the direct dependence is when you depend on a producer in a certain country for your imports. Right? You take 80% from one specific source, you are highly dependent. Now, the twist is that we live in a world where there are global supply chains. So generally products, especially the more sophisticated products, especially the ones that often are classified as strategic, are not really produced in one country, but they are produced with inputs of all different kinds from various sources. And then they are shipped from one country, but that doesn't mean that they're entirely produced in that country. So we need to keep this in mind because something really interesting is happening. And here we are showing it for electronics, but then obviously in the regression is wider than that. But this is just because electronics is such a charismatic sector to look at. What has happened is that the countries that I showed you earlier that sort of picked up the slack from China and the US market, Vietnam, Taiwan, Korea, etc., they, at the same time, in the same sector, increased a lot imports from China. Okay, and so that's what the figure is showing to you, is that if for electronics, in this case, but as I say, it's true more generally, the increase in exports to the US markets is associated with the increase in imports from China. So let me conclude here. So what we are trying to say in this paper is essentially 3 things. The first is that we do observe decoupling, US-China decoupling, and that this seems to be driven by the tariffs, if you want, the trade policies changes that we have seen since 2018-19. Second, we do not see really evidence of reshoring or diversification. One can say we don't see yet evidence of reshoring diversification. It's possible that 10 years from now, things will look different. But for now, that's what the data tell us. And then the third is that the supply chains are really reallocating or being reshuffled. And interestingly, they remain very intertwined with China. So in some sense, what the tariffs really have done is to replace some direct dependence with indirect dependence. Does it make it more resilient? I don't know. It's just a bit different, but not necessarily more resilient. So where are we going next? I think we can go in different directions. I think one thing that we understood so far is that this process of reshuffling of supply chains, decoupling, all these processes will take time. It's not something that a few tariffs will change. It's a long-term process, and probably will require quite a bit more policy intervention. And so there is going to be a tension there between efficiency on the one hand, because think of the subsidies, these are costly policies, and these objectives of decoupling, etc. And the second point that I think is important is that we will likely see, unless there is dialogue, which seems to be quite difficult at the moment, a new set of measures that will come up over time, simply because the realization of the fact that maybe the first round of policies that have been imposed did not achieve what they were supposed to achieve, most likely will lead to more policy intervention going down the road. So I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back at GW. It's been a couple of years, but I am very proud to be a place where my money is going for my daughter's graduate school. So I feel right at home here with my money somewhere in one of these buildings. And it's also a pleasure to follow the excellent paper that was just presented to you. It is really worth reading in great detail. And it caused me to restructure my presentation a bit because it makes the point so well that I thought, well, I have to sort of start off where the paper leaves off and talk about what's going to happen going forward. And there I have a D word, but it's deepening, and it's a deepening of the US-China trade war, which is not a good thing for either country or for the world trading system. Now I'll try to figure out which, there we go. So I'm going to try to cover very quickly some points, some of which overlap what you just heard. US-China trade has peaked and it's declining. That's direct bilateral trade. What is less clear is how much US and China commercial interests are decoupling, and that's a function of the restructuring of the supply chains, and we don't have the data, as Michele said, noted. Investment data lags much more than trade data. And so what has gone on in the last couple of years in terms of Chinese investment in restructuring supply chains in Southeast Asia, new investments in Mexico or in other countries to sort of take up some of the slack or be the China plus one country, that's not showing up in the data yet. And so it could be that we'll have less direct US-China trade, indeed, almost a sure thing that it's going to continue to decline in coming years, as I'll explain, but not necessarily a decoupling of the economic interests of the US and Chinese economies. As the US, and the reason I'm pessimistic is as the US ratchets up its trade and investment controls, and that continues week by week, China responds in kind. And we're likely to see a further heating up of the cold trade war this year and next year, whoever wins in November. So this is going to be a Biden or Trump policy as it has been pretty much for the last 6 years. Now, Chinese participation in regional trading arrangements in the Asia Pacific, unlike the US, which has taken a much more low profile policy posture, gives China an important channel to offset declining sales to the United States. And by contrast, US exporters are hurt by not being in the CPTPP and by the limited scope of the alternative opportunities under the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. And finally, I'll make a comment or two on China's accession to the CPTPP, which took place almost 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago. Those prospects are unlikely. I don't know of anyone in Beijing who worries too much about whether that's going to happen or not anymore. That's sort of a distant policy initiative. But the prospects of U.S. Rejoining the pact, which would have great strategic advantage for the United States in the region, is also slim because of the harsh anti-China and anti-old-style religion trade agreement that served us so well for 50 years. That seems to be in disfavor in the Congress and the administration. This is a table that shows just in numbers what was just shown before in a chart. The chart's probably more elegant. But you can see in terms of declining trade, if you take the last line of the top panel, U.S. imports from China declined by over $100 billion last year from 2022. So it is a significant decline in trade, and that's reflected in the decline in the China's share of U.S. imports that dropped from 21 to a little under 14% last year. Now, looking forward, though, I think the combination of hot and cold wars and the U.S. election campaign is going to continue to prompt new protectionism. We've already seen this most recently with new U.S. tariffs on steel and aluminum, which are pretty much redundant. They're not going to make much of a difference in any trade flows. China doesn't sell us much steel and aluminum anymore because it's already been blocked for a long time by anti-dumping and countervailing duties. But on top of that, the trade war tariffs, plus the additional tariffs announced by President Biden on top of the trade war tariffs, are more of a political symbol for domestic politics than they have much of an impact on commercial relations. But there are prospective new barriers in the pipeline to block Chinese shipments of electric vehicles. There's disputes over access to data, and that's not just an e-commerce issue. That affects a lot of products that have Chinese chips in them, whether they're cars or cranes and at ports. So these are under suspicion for being able to transport data from the United States to China. It's a security issue from people who don't give a good security rationale behind it, but all you have to do is say security and boom, you have a get out of jail free card for imposing any interventionist policy you want. But that's going to continue to impede trade. There's going to be an extension of export controls on high-tech products and on the Chinese side. If it's tit for tat, it will be on critical minerals and components necessary for Western manufacturing. Right now, that's a threat, but it follows the tit for tat policy that we've seen on the tariff side. More troubling, and actually Miles made a brief reference to this before, there are possible additional financial sanctions against Chinese firms for aiding the Russian war effort. To date, China has been pretty careful about following U.S. guidelines, maybe getting pretty close to red lines, but not crossing them, in terms of providing assistance to the Russian military. There seems to be too much slippage, and I think warnings are being issued, or have been issued in the past few weeks, probably being issued this week in Beijing, that major Chinese institutions, including perhaps some significant financial institutions, could be targeted by U.S. sanctions, and that would escalate the sanctions war and lead to a much more difficult environment for conducting any economic diplomacy between the United States and China. I think the Chinese recognize that risk, which is why they've been so careful over the past couple of years. But I don't think they recognize it well enough how they're keeping the Russian military afloat and allowing the war in Ukraine to continue. So that's something that deserves a lot more attention. Of course, if Trump is elected, he's threatened to impose additional tariffs on top of existing tariffs. So, but not just to China, it's across the board, friend and foe alike. So, so China will be in good company because suddenly the Europeans and other countries will join China in protesting U.S. tariff actions. That's not going to help our standing or the ability to create alliances to coordinate policies, both commercial and financial. Of course, there's continued recourse to Section 232 national security exemptions and retaliatory authorities, which are very broad under U.S. law, that allow retaliation when another country doesn't follow the same policies that we do in terms of imposing trade barriers. It seems rather strange to think of it that way after 6-7 decades of reciprocal trade negotiations, but we have that authority that had been seldom used in the post-war era that is now being dusted off again and looked at very closely by Trump's trade advisors. And finally, I think this is important. It hasn't gotten much attention. Everyone, when they talk about carbon border adjustment mechanisms and measures, think about the European Union. But there are two major pieces of legislation in the U.S. Congress being teed up for action next year that could impose carbon border tariffs sooner than the European Union, and done for both environmental reasons if you're Joe Biden, or revenue reasons if you're Donald Trump. And there's going to be a great need for additional revenues in the budget next year, because next year will mark the expiration of Trump's tax cuts. And Republicans will try to extend those as much of those tax cuts as they can. Democrats will like to pare them back and continue to fund social programs and infrastructure programs that have been passed in the Biden administration. Suffice it to say, the Trump tax cuts cannot be fully extended without causing a major fiscal disaster. And so there will be a big fight in the Congress, whoever is elected, on the balance between keeping the tax cuts and not blowing up the budget. That's going to lead politicians of any stripe to say, where can we get more money? And the obvious answer is, well, we don't want to tax our constituents because they vote for us, so we'll tax the foreigners, or at least they'll think they're taxing the foreigners when they pose tariffs, even though the tariffs are often paid for by American consumers, some of which are businesses. I'm depressing myself already. I hope I'm spreading the gloom a little bit. Now, China is following in kind, and so they are de-risking away from U.S. Exports. There's been a large drop in sales to the U.S., but Chinese exports are actually on the rise. And there's concern about effectively dumping overcapacity in Chinese manufacturing onto world markets. That could be happening in a few highlighted products, but basically we see the United States and others acting to defend against dumped or subsidized products in our own market, but we can't get other countries to do it if they feel that they're taking advantage. So I think you're going to see this continued debates over Chinese export expansion going on for a few years. China is, in terms of de-risking, replacing U.S. energy exports with supplies from Russia and Iran. It takes now most of Iran's oil exports, and is diversifying its purchases of corn and soybeans from the United States and Ukraine, which were its primary suppliers, to Brazil. Now, this is to show you how dependent U.S. corn and soybean farmers are on the Chinese market. It's actually more optimistic than it's less optimistic than it shows, because these are 12-month trailing sums. And if you look at what's happened at the end of last year and early this year, China almost totally stopped buying corn and soybeans from the United States and bought it from Brazil. And it may be a demonstration to say they don't need us, and our farm community is very worried about that. But it shows that dependency works is a two-way street. Now, if you can decipher this, you will know a lot about regional integration in the Asia-Pacific region. This is basically taking 27 countries and saying, what trade agreements are they a party to? And there's APEC and the CPTPP and RCEP, IPEF. And the last two columns are interesting because it shows which of these countries China and the United States have free trade arrangements with. And if you look at it, China has arrangements with 18 of the 27 countries. The United States has arrangements with 7. That basically gives you a very simplistic idea that China has more opportunities to access markets in the region, and some of the markets that are growing much faster than the United States market, as a way of compensating for its lost sales in the United States. China is in RCEP. Mike will talk about that more, so I won't go into much detail. But I think it's a great advantage for China to be in RCEP when the United States is not even in CPTPP. And why is that? Because Donald Trump pulled out of CPTPP on his 3rd day in office in 2017. But it's a bipartisan strategic error, because Joe Biden had the opportunity to make amends, to revise the agreement and come back in, and he didn't bother with any of that. So a pox on both their houses, but more importantly, a pox on the competitiveness of the U.S. Trading interests in the Asia-Pacific region. Now, China has applied to the CPTPP, unlike the United States. It did so almost 3 years ago. Little progress has been made, no accession working group, and any country could block China if it wanted to, though most countries don't want to be asked to make that decision. But certainly there are major areas where China's policies do not meet the CPTPP high standards. And so it would have been a long slog to negotiate accession. Unlike the United Kingdom, which applied, negotiated, and ratified its accession agreement starting in 2022, and it's about to become the 12th member of CPTPP later this year. there are other countries in the accession queue, including Taiwan. None of them are moving forward very, very fast as the current CPTPP members conduct their 5-year review of the operations of that agreement. Now, as I noted in the previous draft, China already has free trade agreements with 7 of the 11 CPTPP countries, and all but Mexico and Canada and the UK are linked to China via bilateral free trade agreements, the China-ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, or RCEP. And as a result, you see now China's trade with the CPTPP countries exceeds $1 trillion. So it has got a big market that it has preferential access to, which the United States is much more limited. Now, I'll say it on the record: China is not going to be a member of the CPTPP this decade, or probably longer. But from the Chinese perspective, having that application in the queue already conveys some benefits because it effectively blocks Taiwan from joining the club. And as I said, the U.S. won't rejoin, but instead is pushing the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which, if you look at it, failed to reach agreement on the trade pillar, produced a supply chain arrangement which largely replicates what private businesses had done in response to the pandemic and the U.S.-China trade war shock. Has some interesting specific projects on climate and some hortatory provisions on anti-competition and fair trade. So very limited impetus to new trade and investment in the region, unlike the concrete benefits that tariff and investment preferences have in the RCEP and CPTPP. I'm almost near the end of my time, but I'm also near the end of my presentation. So let me sum up very quickly. The cold trade war will deepen, expanding original trade war restrictions and impeding circumvention efforts. And that will focus not only on Southeast Asia, where there's already discussion of imposing some restrictions on trade from Vietnam and Malaysia and Thailand because of possible Chinese influence, but also will complicate the neighborhood regional association with the United States, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, the successor to NAFTA, in which there's concern about Chinese investment in Mexico seeking to circumvent the U.S. trade war tariffs. That's going to cause tensions between the United States and Mexico going forward towards the 6-year review of that agreement scheduled for the middle of 2026. Chinese export expansion will provoke trade frictions over subsidized and dumped competition in third country export markets. That's going to create more frictions between the United States and many of its allies in the transatlantic and South and Asia Pacific regions. We and the Europeans will increase the use of contingent protection measures at the border and pressure other countries to do the same with regard to electric vehicles, solar panels, and steel. And China will use leverage of its trade and investment preferences with RCEP and ASEAN to sort of encourage those countries to blunt or soften countermeasures against Chinese companies in Southeast Asia. It puts the United States in a difficult strategic position, and one where we've basically painted ourselves in a corner, but can easily paint ourselves out of it, except for the election year politics that complicate trade policy this year. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Maggie, and thanks so much for the invitation. It's been a great day. I've learned a great deal, and it's wonderful to be on this panel. Of course, it's a bit challenging for 2 reasons, especially. Number one, it's challenging to be the last paper before the break. But fortunately, there's a discussant, right? So it'll all fall on Judy. The other challenge is always coming after Jeff when he gives a talk, because he's such a great expositor, and his applied logic is impeccable. But fortunately, it was extremely depressing. So what I'm going to try to do is talk a bit more of the positive side of what's going on in the region, so we can begin the weekend not so depressed. Okay, and I'd like to talk a bit about, as mentioned, the Regional Cooperation Economic Partnership, RCEP, China, and the US. Just some background. As many of you know, the RCEP negotiations were launched in November of 2012. But many of you may not know there was an ASEAN-centric agreement. If you look at it, it's not all about China like we hear all the time. It really was an ASEAN centralities in this. And it was part of a long process of Asian integration proposals that emerged even as early as the end of the Uruguay round negotiations, where in the early 1990s, you had Mahathir of Malaysia very upset that the US and the EU were playing chicken at the WTO at the Uruguay round. So he proposed during a visiting Chinese delegation an East Asian economic bloc. Okay. Now, that wasn't very ASEAN. It seemed a bit aggressive. And so if you look it up, you'll see it was recast as the East Asian Economic Caucus. And a caucus of what, one never knows. But anyway, Mahathir certainly didn't lose face, and that was what was important. But this idea of close Asian integration in the modern sense really kind of started from that, because in that agreement, in the fourth ASEAN summit, where you see this East Asian economic caucus, you also see the ASEAN free trade area starts out, and this is in 1992. Fast forward a bit to the Asian financial crisis, and the need for cooperation becomes extremely clear as to why one has to get closer together. Now, as things panned out, it really wasn't clear if this would be an ASEAN +3, China, Japan, and South Korea, or an ASEAN +6, which is the ASEAN +3, Australia, New Zealand, and India. But there were a lot of proposals on both sides. And some of them came to be more concrete, like the AMRO came out of the ASEAN +3, and there were discussions on the ASEAN +6. So what ended up happening is we see during this process, as it's evolving, we also have the TPP gets launched, essentially, which started off as this 4 small countries, right? The P4 and the US picked it up and started this major negotiation, which was going to be a gold standard agreement with cutting edge chapters and all of this. China did not welcome this, if you will. He was afraid that it was being contained. There was one Australian scholar who said this was economic warfare against China. And arguably by the November 2011 summit, Obama administration sort of told the Chinese to relax on this. It really wasn't about them. It was about us and getting together with our allies. But it certainly did play a role in pushing through this idea of a regional comprehensive economic partnership, which gets launched in November of 22. It has 15 member states. In order to be a negotiating member of the RCEP, one had to have in place a free trade area with ASEAN, right? Showing that centrality. India, which has a free trade area with ASEAN, pulled out in 2019 for reasons that aren't so complicated, but I won't get into them. But the agreement was signed in 2022, and it's been in effect since last year. The Philippines ratified it in 2023, and Myanmar, of course, for its own special reasons, is still on hold. Okay, so we've got this agreement with 14 countries, since Myanmar isn't in, but it's moving forward. A little bit on what the template looks like, and it's natural, of course, to compare the CPTPP to RCEP. And I mean, one way of trying to do it is to say that the TPP really focused on the interests of advanced countries, right? That's one way of putting it. And others say it's really ambitious. It wants to be cutting edge. It wants to have chapters that are going to be able to lead us forward at a time when the WTO wasn't. But let's face it, this is something that the US really wanted. And so that's why you see not only, market access and some ambitious things on non-tariff barriers and, cumulative rules of origin, but you also have labor and the environment included in the CPTPP. These also, by the way, are being revisited with the general review right now. So it's going to be probably updated. The RCEP, on the other hand, is more focused on the comparative advantage of its developing countries, who disproportionately had a strong weight, obviously, in that grouping. And it required a flexibility that some of us that follow trade would say it makes it a shallower agreement. And that's true if you think of it in terms of ambition, in terms of how deep the integration agreement is. Michele would obviously be able to tell us exactly what those areas were. But it was a negotiation of what was possible. And if you think of what was possible, they actually came up with an agreement in a very ASEAN way, which was to say, okay, we agree on this now, and then we'll deal with these other more complicated issues later. Right? As I mentioned, services, for example. There's both a positive list of services and a negative list of services. And it's not, by the way, only developing countries in one and developed in the other. It's not the way it breaks down. But in the agreement says after 6 years, it's all going to be negative lists. The same was true in the last session. The ISDS was mentioned, Investment State Dispute Settlement. Couldn't come to an agreement. They're going to talk about it in 6 years. Okay, so this idea of trying to do what's possible, and I say here, WTO, take note. I think this is something we haven't been able to do with the WTO very well. We haven't been able to compromise this very divergent interest with now, 166 member countries. We haven't been able to do it. RCEP actually showed a pretty impressive example of that if you think of the countries the diversity of the countries that are going into it. Okay, it has 20 chapters, tariff cuts on 92% of the products, on HS basis. CPTPP was 96%. It also has cumulative rules of origin as a way of sort of supply, promoting supply chains. Some, NTB liberalization. As I mentioned, it's a bit of a mixed bag on services. It's not that ambitious, but services are in there. There are no chapters on state-owned enterprises or labor or the environment. Okay, so it's very, very different from the CPTPP from that point of view. On other issues like intellectual property rights is in there, but it's really WTO plus things, right? So the core of the agreement is more, is obviously more basic. But as I mentioned, it's a living agreement. There's plans to expand over time. And I mean, by the way, when I mentioned this is the ASEAN way, I mentioned ASEAN negotiated a free trade area in 1992, and it was officially there. But what was free trade was defined as 0 to 5% tariffs in 10 manufactured goods, right? As things promoted, goes over time, ASEAN, it expands, goes to 0%, vast majority of the goods included. So you see this following that sort of a pattern. I think that's a reason to be optimistic about this going forward. Also, in terms of enlargement, there are no geographical restrictions. Jeff talked about the UK joining the CPTPP. There's 6 other countries, 6 other economies in line to do that. Most of them not from the Asia-Pacific region. So that too doesn't have a geographical restriction. The countries that have applied, however, the RCEP do tend to be regional. Bangladesh, Hong Kong, SAR, and Sri Lanka have applied. They haven't gone. India, by the way, can come back to the table anytime it wants to negotiate, but is not about to do that soon. Okay, now what are the economic effects of the agreement? Peter Petrie, my longtime co-author, Sin-Young Park, who's at the Asian Development Bank, and I sort of estimated the effects of RCEP in a East Asian Economic Review study in 2021. And I thought I'd sort of talk a bit about the results because it's very, very relevant to what we're looking at today. It uses a CG model, the details in the paper, to look at three things essentially: the economic cost of the U.S.-China trade war, CPTPP, and RCEP. Okay, and just to briefly go over some of the numbers. The U.S.-China trade war is very costly. It reduces global incomes by $514 billion annually. Which, and if you look at it and you say, well, I mean, U.S. economy right now is what, 28 trillion, and it's big, but this is on a permanent basis. When I lecture my students, I'll always say this: look, when I go out and I have to raise money for a scholarship for SICE at Hopkins, right? It's $40,000 a year about in tuition in Bologna, right? If I want to get one scholarship, I have to raise $1 million in endowment, and then I get this 4% payoff that pays that 40,000, right? I just want 10 scholarships, that's $10 million. So this is the payoff, or if this is the opposite of the payoff, this is the cost, is $515 billion on an annual basis. So divide that by 0.04, you could see what kind of an investment, private sector investment you need to pay would be the payoff. Or the negative payoff for that. So it's not insignificant. The biggest losers, of course, would be China, 515 billion. So interestingly, that's even more than what the aggregate was. And the US loses $41 billion. But the big victim is world trade, which, and if you look at these trade patterns, world trade contracts by almost $1 trillion. Because of the U.S.-China trade war. That's really what is hitting. And the big, obviously, the China and the U.S. are the ones that pay the most out of this. So it's a very big cost. It's a very big hit to globalization anyway. In terms of the effects of RCEP, it's, I would say, relatively solid increase in global incomes of a permanent increase of $263 billion. A year, which is slightly more than what the CPTPP would be, which is $218 billion, right? But again, these are permanent increases. It's interesting to look at what the breakdown is. I mean, what the global benefits derive from the various instruments that are being liberalized within the RCEP agreement. And 2/3 of it come in non-tariff barriers. Now, maybe that's not that surprising because per force, they all have a free trade area with each other. So really what is added to this template is what's going on with the non-tariff barriers, but it underscores how important that is. The cumulative rules of origin comes out to 16%, which is not insignificant, but actually it was less than we thought we would get. So it really is about liberalizing non-tariff barriers in goods and services. What is more interesting, however, I think, from the RCEP agreement, if you think of it and kind of breaking it down, unpacking it, it's what the big effects come from are integrating China, Japan, and Korea in this, right? They're the group that did not have any significant trilateral relationships. You had some bilateral thing between South Korea and China, but very superficial, waiting for RCEP. RCEP will do a lot in integrating these economies. And from a trade point of view, this is what the effects would be of RCEP on trade patterns. And what it ends up doing is it increases world trade by about $500 billion, which is significant. And about a little over 60% of this is due to deeper trade between China, South Korea, and Japan. Right, so that's what's happening. And if you think of it since we're starting to talk about competition and these big things in strategic, what this is doing, it is bringing together three countries that compete very heavily with the United States in key advanced manufacturing. Okay, so this kind of comes to Jeff's point about the U.S.'s staying on the sidelines in all of these things. It is going to have ultimately a implication for U.S. strategic interests. So just to conclude, and I'm on time, I think, pretty much. RCEP is going to be economically significant, even though a lot of people poo-poo it because it's not as deep as the CPTPP, but it does have some real gains, particularly in Northeast Asia. But it's also strategically important. And we can go more into it. I think Jeff talked about it. quite a bit about what this means for the US, but it is, even though it's ASEAN-centric, obviously China is playing a major role in this. And if you think about leadership, this is an important question because when the US withdrew from the TPP, it really wasn't about the economics as much as it was the strategic issues. When Trump was elected, I know that several TPP leaders went to tell him, look, don't pull out of this. It'll be misinterpreted. Because in Asia, when you look at, you can't separate the strategic from the economic, the strategic from the trade. You have to be there. And this was dodged by, as Jeff said, by President Trump. And then President Biden hasn't done anything. So the US is no longer a player in there. And the one thing I would actually put a footnote on in what Jeff was saying is I am not 100% convinced that China will never be a member of the CPTPP. I remember once that I'd mentioned that it might apply and I was shot down. No, China will never apply to it. It's going to be very difficult for China to do that. But if you look at some of the discussions in China about, okay, yeah, we got to make a lot of changes, but this is where we want to go anyway in the negotiation. I think that the bigger challenge is whether or not, now with the UK in there and with Japan and Australia, how easy it would be to get in from a political point of view. But anyway, I wouldn't put the probability at 0. I'd put it low, like you would say, but I wouldn't put it at 0. So, and I mentioned the trade war is costly. We've already talked quite a bit about this, but I think it's important to kind of underscore that it's really China and the US that are losing out from these issues really quite a bit. And in Asia, and the rest of Asia, they feel it's very uncomfortable, right? They don't want to choose from these two leaders. And so the fact that you don't have this kind of strategic interaction is a problem in the region. So anyway, there are, as we've talked a lot about, there are real issues to work out, but they're obviously doing it. And it's interesting to see in Michele's paper, and some of the other things we were talking about earlier about reglobalization or whatever that means. It too holds risks, right? You got to ask yourself, really, is it worth it? I mean, do you gain a lot of strategic, just an example would be, do you gain something in terms of economic security if China exports through Vietnam or exports directly? Anyway, that's a big issue, but it's an important question. And again, there's this, the problem of the US leadership role. So I did not want to end on a depressing note. So, the current political situation seems bleak, it's true, but hope does spring eternal. So, okay, thank you.
So you've all heard about the pressure on me. Here we have the last person before we get to Q&A and whatever you're going to do on a Friday night. I have 7 minutes. So my job, as I take it, is to sort of remind you of a few key takeaways from each person's paper, and then hopefully challenge, I hope, both the speakers and the audience to think about a few questions related to each presentation. So I'm going to say that Michele helped us start on a really positive note. As a trade economist who works a lot on China and global supply chains, I really liked his paper and his presentation. First of all, just a few takeaways. Some of the things he concluded that I thought were very important were that US import growth of Chinese goods subject to tariffs has slowed. We have actually seen that. Now, anybody who's taken undergraduate trade might say, wow, the textbook is right. You put on a tariff, it slows down trade. Yep, it did. We also see some evidence of diversion, so trade diversion to other suppliers rather than seeing a big drop in global trade. He also found, reassuringly, I think, no consistent evidence of reshoring or diversification of US imports, nor evidence of overall deglobalization. And to me, especially studying global supply chains, he found that the supply chains remain connected to China. Those of you who have been exploring this subject know that within a supply chain, relationships between lead firms and all the other firms in the chain are really important. Take a long time to build, are expensive, and most companies do not want to lose their prized suppliers who are able to really meet their specifications. So, moving or adding or subtracting players in the chain is not necessarily a very good move to make. So interestingly, he also cited some evidence that direct links have been replaced by indirect links. So a few questions. I noticed in his results that Asia's share of US imports remained high and constant during the trade war. So there's a big role of factory Asia in the US-China GVCs. So it struck me that this might be a little bit of evidence that China is moving some of its GVC's tasks on its own to Vietnam, Taiwan, or other players in the Asian region, rather than by US impetus shifting the chain. China itself may be shifting the chain. Mexico seems to have benefited from some trade diversion. And I wondered, is this evidence of nearshoring done by US GVCs bringing tasks closer to home, or is it China investing in Mexico to get around the restraints? Finally, this kind of reshuffling, as Michele said, is very costly. So I would wonder how he would respond to those who argue that this is necessary to achieve resilience. Jeff said, sober up. Things don't look too good. When I got to this one, I too was sort of like, oh boy, I don't know where the world is going now. But a few takeaways here would be the US is tightening its original trade investment restrictions against China, and China's retaliating. China has options, at least through RCEP. It could potentially mitigate some losses from the trade war. But the US has backed away from its options, in particular the CPTPP. Jeff expects that the US will likely respond to any trade expansion that China experiences with some of our classic discriminatory measures, anti-dumping, countervailing duties, et cetera, and will pressure perhaps the EU and other countries to do the same. So yes, we're sobering up at this point. So a few questions here. One is that US escalation of trade restrictions and this isolation from global trade will be extremely costly to itself. And we've already had some estimates of what the trade war has cost the United States thus far, and it's not small. So how much more is the US likely to lose? Second, what are the implications of this deepening Cold War or deepening US-China trade war for the efficiency of US GVCs? Are we shooting ourselves in the foot further? And finally, I think that this deepening really moves the US and the world further away from achieving any real improvement in national security or resilience, let alone welfare. And I wonder what Jeff thinks about what we can do. Oh, I will just mention one other thing. You might have noticed that the use of the Cold War, the US-China trade Cold War. I noted that, and then I stepped back and thought, this is actually a very insightful comment, an insightful name, because Jeff also mentioned this sort of responsive China moving away from its relations to the US and shifting more toward Iran, Russia, et cetera, which is reminiscent of US-Russia trade, US-Soviet Union Cold War. So another sobering note. And finally, Mike Plummer brought us back a little bit of happiness to our story, I think. In his discussion of RCEP, particularly I note that he comments on the fact that the trade war is costly, but especially for China and the US. And it actually caused global real income to fall significantly below the 2030 projections he has in his study. RCEP itself has significant economic benefits. In his work, he evaluates them as incremental to the implementation of CPTPP. And in that case, he shows that RCEP itself could more than counteract trade war losses for much of the Asian members. Finally, he also notes that RCEP would increase trade among members substantially, especially China, Japan, and Korea, although he does find some small positive incremental effects on US-China trade as well. So here are my questions for the following. You may not have been able to see this as quickly in his charts that he showed you, but he shows a dramatic reduction in trade across many partners in the world due to the US-China trade war. We don't often hear about this. So I'm curious what the main drivers are of these large negative spillovers to all the rest of the world and the various partners that he showed. Secondly, he argues that RCEP will raise efficiency of global value chains in Asia. I think he's probably right, but does that really explain or help us understand these positive incremental effects on US-China trade post-RCEP? I would have thought that those might have been, the US and China might have been, or at least the US would have been a loser here. And finally, since most of the world's poorest countries are actually in his category called ROW, rest of world, how should we think about the incremental losses that ROW incur from the RCEP? I'll stop there.
And I would first invite each speaker respond to Judy's questions. Judy's questions might not have an easy answer at the moment, but I think we should give the speaker a chance to respond to them first before we take any questions from the audience.
Should I go first?
Start.
Yeah. So thanks so much especially because I think you managed to sum up the key messages. At least I don't want to speak for the others, but for my paper, it's definitely in an excellent way. And the questions are very interesting. So the first question, just to remind you, was on what's happening in Asia. So if, I made the argument that the tariffs had a lot to do with the reorganization, but it's just the tariff. No, it's something that has been going on for some time, and part of it is simple economics. As wages rise in China, some parts of the production shifts to other countries. Incidentally, you were talking about the Belt and Road Initiative in the previous session. Unfortunately, the Belt and Road Initiative, the discussions surrounding it took almost entirely a geopolitical dimension, but there was also an economics rationale behind it that was a bit sidelined. And I think these processes were very much part of it and made a lot of sense from the economics point of view. The second question was what's happening in Mexico. So if we find evidence of, so Mexico is more linked. Inside, actually, my boss at the IMF had a new paper that has Cold War in the title, and they say basically the same thing that we are saying, but they found a very good names for these countries, which is the connector countries. No, they connect the two blocks, or in this case, China and the US. Mexico is definitely one of those. Is it happening because of US firms or because of Chinese firms, FDI? I think it's probably both. I mean, we see definitely through the FDI market data that there are many announcements from China as well. So those are both there. The last question is the tricky one. So resilience, excuse me, on resilience. And many would make the argument that, it may be costly, but it's necessary. And so what do you say on that? My argument would be, first, make a case for it. And what is the case? There needs to be some market failures. And maybe there are market failures. So maybe firms that went to China didn't consider the fact that there was excessive concentration there. But that starts from the market failures, not just from the assumption that because an import comes from a certain location is risky. And second, do it right, in the sense that if you say that there is a market failure, then there is an obvious logic for government intervention. But the first thing, if the goal is diversification, is try to reduce trade costs. That's the obvious way to try to achieve diversification. Just jumping into subsidizing certain sectors doesn't seem necessarily the right thing to do. It can be justified as well in certain cases, but it's a little bit suspicious when this is done without a proper assessment of market failures and economic pressure. Stop here.
I'll be brief. The first point, though, is the most important, and that is, if you want a summary of my paper, don't look at my first slide, look at Judy's comments, because she did a wonderful job. Now, second point, her question was how much more will it cost the United States going forward? And that's a wonderful new paper for Michele and Carolyn Freund and others to work on. But you'll have to do the assumptions of what the additional protection is. But you've got the model all set up, and it would be very worthwhile before the election to talk about what the cost would be if if one of the two candidates gets his way. The third point, will the Cold Trade War improve security and resilience or worsen it by decreasing productivity and efficiency? And I think the answer is undoubtedly the latter for both countries. But there will be efforts to try to minimize the downside by making other arrangements with third countries. Now, speaking of third countries, well, one point that was just raised about Mexico being a connector country, you have to think of Mexico not just as a connector country to the United States, but for China, it may be more valuable as both a final market for its goods and as a connector country to third markets, particularly in Latin America. And I think given the rules of origin in the USMCA and other restrictions and surveillance by the United States, you might see more Chinese investment going into Mexico as a platform as an export platform for Latin America. Thank you.
Okay. I think that I can sort of, in getting to Judy's very interesting questions, I think they mostly deal with some of the data. And
is it on?
And I think what we get in our results in that paper, I mentioned that the negative effects on China was $515 billion, and the United States was only 41 billion. If you look at the trade effects, the Chinese effects on trade are slightly more than the income effects, but for the US, they're actually about, as I recall, like $350 billion. Much more than on the income side and multiple. And the reason for this is a lot of the sectors being affected are the sectors in which the US doesn't have very high value added, right? So they're part of these supply chains that are going in. So you see a very large disruption in trade, relatively speaking, with when we have these trade wars. So I think this is what we're seeing in the data. And it's hard to get right at the GVCs, certainly in the model we're using. It's a CG model. I think we had 40 sectors and 25 regions. And you can't look at GVCs with that. Now, what we did is we used another piece we did with the Asian Development Bank was to sort of do a side model, MRIO model. So we used a separate, econometric model that allowed us to get much more into detail and show what the effects would be. And definitely you do see with these, it was a different style. It wasn't the trade wars we did with that. It was sort of geopolitical fragmentation. Actually presented at the IMF. And you do see definitely it gets hit. So you've got a lot of exposure on the value chains in these areas that they don't come out directly in the model, but we can infer that that's the case. In terms of what's happening to Row, again, we've only got 25 different regions in the model, and some of them are the Row economies are so small they're just not there, and they get put into sort of a big grouping, and we were more focused on the Asia Pacific. So if you want to get Brunei, I mean, good luck. It's really difficult to do to try to get the model to converge with that. But I think what you'll see eventually, though, with these agreements, with our work that we did on RCEP and the CPTPP, in general, these agreements are quite open. You don't see a lot of what we'd call binary trade diversion in these areas because they tend to be open. And just one last point on that: if you look at European integration, the European Single Market Program, which was launched in the, in the mid about 1986 and was called EC 1992, they already had a customs union. So it wasn't at all about tariffs. It was about everything else. And if you look at the economic studies that look at those effects, most of the policies, the measures put in place were non-discriminatory, right? Trade facilitation tends to be non-discriminatory. The effects often on investment tend to be non-discriminatory, these sorts of things. And so, usually those models will put like 60% of that would be non-discriminatory. I think you see a lot of that with the TPP and the CPTP, RCEP and CPTPP, because like in RCEP, they've already got free trade areas, all these countries. So it's really about everything else. And we get these NTBs accounting for 2/3 of the gains. That's because these things haven't been addressed now. Now you're going to have some inevitably trade diversion with that, but then again, you also have what the literature would call negative trade diversion as well with these multilateral things. So I think that's what we're looking at. But those are good questions. I have to go back into the data to get these exact numbers.
Thank you very much for the responses. Now we'll take a round of questions from the audience. We'll do a batch of 3.
Yeah, I was in customs, so I can tell you how the public has no concept on how complicated, convoluted, and irrational trade is. And I know that Mr. Schott was in Treasury, so he's fully aware that there never was and never will be a time when trade is apolitical. And I certainly agree that killing TPP was just shooting yourself for absolutely no reason. Domestic international politics, usually it's evident. I never could find out, and maybe he can say what it was that Trump thought he was accomplishing by killing the TPP.
Take a second question.
Stanley Kober. In 1812, we declared war on Britain. We were fed up with the orders in council. If we could react that way to an attempt to pressure us economically, why couldn't the Chinese react in a similar manner?
Hear anybody speculate about Russia and how the increasing trade with between China and Russia as factors into this and compensates? So I understand it's like $100 billion already of trade that didn't exist prior to this invasion.
So I'll let the panelists decide which question to respond to by whom. We'll give them a minute to decide.
No, on the TPP thing, it really is impossible to sort of answer that question without looking at the politics of it, or how if I might say, how to look at the Biden administration. Joe Biden, who was very pro TPP when he was vice president, or even Hillary Clinton when she was a candidate, all of a sudden she becomes anti-TPP. It's just the issue we have in this country is we don't do a great job telling the positive story about trade. And I think that's important. It becomes anecdotal. And Trump didn't care about numbers or anything like that. He just decided this was going to be a bad agreement. He even said it would be a way of China to dominate the US market, even though China was not a member of it. But I think it becomes very political. And what I'm concerned about, we're stumbling into talking about history, we're stumbling into Smoot-Hawley again. I mean, if you look at some of the arguments, they're just about the same. And it's not until the export sector that sort of starts to protest on this that it's going to be. I think that if Trump does get elected, we're going to see some of that, because I think as Jeff mentioned, he's promising an across the board increases in tariffs and these sorts of things, and they will be, responded to. And I think that's a real threat. And it would be really sad to it's sad to face that tragedy again, because Milton Friedman, who believed every economic gyration was due to money, said the one exception he had was that Smoot-Hawley deepened the recession and made things a lot worse. So I think that's an issue.
So I guess I won't talk about the question on war. On Russia's trade, maybe I can say something on that one. So what we do observe, so in this recent paper that we colleagues did at the fund, I was looking at blocks, and basically based on UN voting, you can group countries, that are more political distant from each other. And essentially there are two blocks, one that is more centered on the US and one that is more centered on China. And you see that over time, and especially starting in 2022, the trade between these two blocks has been declining, especially relative to the trade within blocks. Now, one thing that is very important, I think, in this divergence that we observed in the data is Russia. And in fact, that's why it starts in 2022, because a lot of it is the sanctions and the commodities. Now, one thing that we did at the fund, and it's in my group, but I just inherited, so I take no merit for it, is this thing that's called Port Watch, which is basically monitors maritime trade shipping, but just tracking where all ships are going. And this is super effective, has been very helpful to see what happened with the Red Sea or with the drought in the Panama Canal. So my colleagues did a box on the wheel, so it's published there, and it was tracking what happened to tankers from Russia. And so that's basically where oil goes. And you see that has been redirected. So the fact that there were sanctions did not eliminate the trade, it's just redirected the trade. And so that's part of the story of what is happening. And it's just there is as a fact. It was not only to China, but it was also to several other countries. But for sure, the fact that there were sanctions imposed by a number of Western countries moved trade in other directions.
Okay, very briefly, on Trump's action, it was anti-Obama. Obama had his fingerprints on TPP. Trump said, no, this is no good. Trump then changed the NAFTA. What did he do with the NAFTA? He put in TPP provisions in it. Mostly, followed with a few increased protectionist measures and labor provisions. But most of the change from NAFTA was adding TPP to the agreement. Nobody says that. I don't understand it. But it's typical of how politicians distort trade and trade policies. Second point on Russia makes me a bit nostalgic. The last thing I did in government in the early 1980s was argue that Europe was becoming too dependent on supplies of natural gas from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had just built the Yamal pipeline. It was planning a second one. So the level of flows of natural gas was relatively limited at the time. But you could see, okay, this is an adversary, and they could turn off the spigots. Well, it took 40 years to do it, but they did. Now, there's a bigger consequence, because a lot of the post-war era was posited on the fact that you wouldn't have military interventions disrupting supply chains. You might have political pressures or this or that, but you wouldn't have the shutting off of supplies, of critical energy supplies. You wouldn't have military attacks on important shipping lanes as you do in the Red Sea. All of these affect the calculus of governments and businesses on the cost of doing business and what type of political risk you have to pay what political risk insurance you have to pay. That has changed dramatically as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I don't think it'll be difficult to go back from that to where we were before. So that's going to be an additional cost on the trading system and international commerce for the foreseeable future.
Exhausted questions? Any more questions for final?
Thank you so much. Amir Sadeghi from S&P. I have a question not directly related to trade, but do you think that what's going on right now would affect renminbi becoming a major currency? Just wondering your opinion about that. Thank you.
Like an IMF question.
Great. Thank you. I'm Stanley Wu from the Atlantic Council. And my question would be more about this, like the whole thing about rerouting from the like China to US trade. Is it important to put a distinction between whether we are rerouting the goods from Vietnam or Mexico and like kind of going to the routes of origin? And do you see it's like a big difference between a Chinese company actually investing in Mexico and Vietnam, or it's more like Vietnam taking the initiative to reroute things and getting some profit from it? The whole thing, like, how does the US view it as a thing that's important to its national security? Thank you.
Quick question, probably related to your colleague's paper. If you have two blocks, where do you put India, Brazil, Chile, Indonesia? I'll give Chile as an example. I think the Wall Street Journal gave that too. Are they on which side are they?
Thank you. I'll have the speakers respond in 10 minutes.
Yeah, so let me start from the last. I mean, these blocks, we had several papers at the fund where there are different configurations of blocks. And honestly, they tend to change quite a bit. And they're all based on these ideal point distance measures that political and international relations scientists have developed based on UN voting. But obviously, there is quite a bit of judgment. In the last paper that is out, India and Brazil, and I believe Chile, but India and Brazil for sure are in the group of non-aligned.
The third one.
The third group. So there is, yeah. So that's the. But now the other questions on the renminbi, the role of the renminbi. I mean, two things. The first is that if you look at the data, the dominant role of the dollar is still out there. Like if you look at the use of the dollars in trade finance or international reserves, it's very, very high. Now, it is true that as over time, it has happened that as trade patterns start diverging, then currencies follow. So it's a legitimate question to have. So if you continue on in the pattern that we were discussing of fragmentation, then this would support probably changes, but probably this will take time. So I was listening recently to a conference that Barry Eichengreen gave, I think it was in 2010, and he was predicting that there would be a completely different configuration of currencies by 2020. Obviously, we're in 2024, it hasn't happened, but like economists, that's our profession to explain later why it didn't happen, what we told earlier. But
Yeah.
Well, we always say ceteris paribus.
yeah. So, yeah, let me stop here.
Yeah, let me just add an addendum to that, because I agree that given Chinese policies and restrictions on its financial markets, it ain't going to happen. But there's another variable in that equation. If the United States screwed up its financial policies as badly as it's moving on its trade policies, then you could have a problem. But nobody's talking about screwing up US financial markets unless you adopt tax cuts that blow out the budget and then create some real danger. But the advantage of the United States is earned by the depth and transparency of its capital markets.
I can say something on the question of GVCs that you mentioned. Yeah, you were asking about whether it makes a difference if China is moving tasks or if, you know, the US is just buying from another supplier. Yeah, I think what I was trying to get at is the idea that of the importance of a long-term relationship with your suppliers. It has efficiency effects, cost effects. It also affects the ability of a supply chain lead firm to count on the made precise measurements and manufacturing to specification, all of these things which take a long time to build. So if a trade war is actually forcing a GVC lead firm to choose completely different suppliers in another country and start building from scratch those relationships, that could really escalate costs. And they may not be as efficient a choice as your original supplier. They likely aren't. So that's why I was kind of raising a distinction to the extent that maybe China is still overseeing production, but seeing it in Vietnam or Taiwan or wherever might sort of bring some continuity and therefore lower, keep the costs lower than they would otherwise.
Right. I think that brings us to a conclusion. I want to thank all the speakers, discussants, and participants for a full day of insightful discussions. And all the programs, all the video recording will be posted on YouTube. So feel free to revisit our channel, subscribe to our IIEP channel. I also want to thank the support we have received from the Ning Li Family Foundation Endowment and Frank Wong and Daniel Stramillo and IIEP Executive Circle for making this event and many other events possible. Please stay in tune. Stay tuned with us. Come back, visit us, and stay engaged with us. On that note, thank you very much again, and have a great weekend.